2023 marks the 10th anniversary of the passing of Professor Stephen A. Resnick, an esteemed Marxist economist whose profound impact on the field of economic theory and education continues to resonate within academic and intellectual circles. A distinguished member of the University of Massachusetts Amherst faculty, Resnick was renowned for his innovative approach to Marxian economics. His collaboration with Richard Wolff led to groundbreaking works, notably Knowledge and Class and Economics, Marxian versus Neoclassical. These texts challenged conventional economic thought, offering a fresh perspective on class dynamics and societal structures. Resnick's academic contributions were characterized by a deep commitment to exploring the complexities of economic systems through a Marxian lens. He was particularly noted for his rejection of epistemological essentialism, advocating for a nuanced understanding of societal processes and the role of class defined in terms of surplus labor. This approach not only enriched Marxist theory, but also provided a critical framework for analyzing contemporary economic issues. Beyond his scholarly achievements, Resnick was a passionate educator. His dedication to teaching was evident in his ability to engage students with challenging ideas, encouraging them to think critically about economic theories and their real-world implications. His influence extended beyond the classroom, inspiring a generation of students and scholars to approach economics with a critical and inquisitive mindset. As we commemorate a decade since his passing, Stephen Resnick's legacy endures through the continued relevance of his work and the lasting impact he had on his students and colleagues. His contributions to Marxist economics and his commitment to education remain a source of inspiration, underscoring the enduring significance of his work in the ever-evolving field of economic thought. Welcome to our lecture on a pivotal chapter from a significant work in Marxist economic theory. Today, we delve into a unique analysis that challenges traditional views on communist societies, as presented by the authors. The chapter we're discussing today offers something quite unprecedented: a systematic, non-deterministic class analysis of communist societies. This approach is notably absent in the works of Marx, Engels, and others within the Marxian tradition. While various conceptualizations of communism have been proposed over the centuries, from early Christian communal living to utopian socialism, a consistent theme has been the lack of a systematic, non-deterministic perspective, particularly one that incorporates a class analysis focused on the social organization of surplus. The authors argue that previous theorizations of communism have generally lacked two critical elements. Firstly, they have not employed a systematically non-deterministic or anti-essentialist perspective to define and elaborate on communism. Secondly, they have not applied a class perspective where class refers to the social organization of surplus, specifically how it is produced, appropriated, and distributed in a communist society. In the first part of the book, socialism and communism are treated as roughly synonymous to focus on developing the basic class analysis. However, as the discussion progresses, the authors delineate the profound differences between socialism and communism, as well as the consequences of these differences. The absence of class analysis, particularly in its surplus labor definition, is not surprising in non-Marxist accounts of communism. However, it is somewhat puzzling within Marxian conceptualizations, which typically do refer to class. The authors note that Marxism includes multiple different notions of class, and hence of class analysis. They emphasize that one of Marx's significant contributions was conceptualizing class as the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus within society. Yet, this conceptualization has not been used to theorize communism, the very society Marxists have preferred. The existing Marxian treatments of communism have used different concepts of class, defined in terms of property and power rather than surplus. This has led to conclusions about communism, socialism, and the history of the USSR that are radically different from those presented in this book. The authors believe that the absence of the surplus labor notion of class and non-determinist reasoning in most Marxian conceptualizations of socialism and communism has imposed profound costs on the movements favoring them over the last century. These absences have hindered the revolutionary potential of the regimes these movements sometimes created, preventing a possible transition from a capitalist to a communist class structure. In this and subsequent chapters, the authors offer a definition and theorization of communism and socialism that differs radically from prevailing views. This different theory provides a correspondingly different way to interpret events within regimes claiming to have produced socialism or communism. The focus is on the USSR's Bolshevik Revolution, considered the preeminent socialist communist revolution of the 20th century. The first section of this chapter presents the basic terms of the author's theory of communism, highlighting how it differs from other major theories, especially the traditional or classical Marxian view. Despite rejecting the deterministic rendition of capitalism, typical of classical Marxism, the authors respond to that discourse by focusing on class, conceived as the appropriation and distribution of surplus labor, and by committing to overdetermination, offering a fresh perspective within the complex, contested history of Marxism. In this lecture, we will explore a chapter from Steve Resnick's A General Class Theory, focusing on the classical tradition of Marxism and its interpretation of socialism and communism. This chapter provides a critical examination of traditional Marxist views and proposes a new perspective on these concepts. The classical Marxist tradition, as outlined by figures like Engels, Kautsky, and Lenin, views socialism and communism through two primary lenses: collectivity and classlessness. Collectivity refers to a societal shift towards communal ownership and control, particularly over the means of production. This shift is not just economic but also cultural and political, promoting a collective consciousness over individualistic tendencies. Classlessness, in the traditional Marxist view, is seen as the elimination of class divisions, primarily understood in terms of unequal distributions of property and political power. The classical Marxist argument posits that by transferring collective ownership to those who produce society's wealth and ensuring democratic power rests with the citizens, the root causes of class divisions can be eradicated. However, this chapter challenges the traditional Marxist perspective by arguing that it has not adequately addressed the complexities of class and power dynamics in socialist and communist societies. The authors argue that classical Marxism has been too deterministic, focusing on the idea that socialism or communism would naturally emerge from the contradictions of capitalism. The chapter also highlights the evolution of Marxist thought throughout the 20th century, noting a shift in focus from issues of property and production to power and democracy. This shift reflects a broader debate within the Marxist tradition about the essential characteristics of socialism and communism. Some theorists have emphasized the importance of collective ownership and planned economies, while others have focused on the distribution of power and the realization of true democracy. Interestingly, this shift towards a focus on power distribution is also mirrored in non-Marxian accounts of socialism and communism. The chapter references No's concept of feasible socialism, which combines collectivized property ownership with competitive market economies, suggesting a blend of Marxist collectivism, democratic power distribution, and capitalist market mechanisms. In conclusion, this chapter from A General Class Theory invites us to reconsider traditional Marxist interpretations of socialism and communism. It encourages a more nuanced understanding of these concepts, taking into account the complexities of class, power, and democracy. This re-examination is crucial for understanding the historical and contemporary relevance of Marxist theory in analyzing and shaping socialist and communist societies. Our basic terms: different notion of socialism and communism. We diverge from traditional Marxist theorists in our understanding of socialism and communism. Our interpretation of Marx's class analytics leads us to a unique perspective: class defined beyond property or power. Unlike the common interpretation, we define class not by unequal distributions of property or power. These factors interact with a society's class structure but are fundamentally distinct from it. Surplus labor as class indicator. Class, in our view, is a process where individuals perform surplus labor, labor beyond what is necessary for their own reproduction. This surplus labor is then appropriated and distributed within society, forming the basis of our class analysis. Questions raised in class analysis. Our analysis focuses on who performs necessary and surplus labor, how this is organized, and its impact on society. It also examines who receives and distributes the surplus, and how these distributions affect society. Interdependence and coexistence of class structures. We explore the interdependence among different groups involved in surplus labor and how multiple class structures may coexist within a society. Interaction of class and non-class processes. Our approach looks at how class processes, production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus interact with non-class processes, political, cultural, etc., in a mutually constitutive manner. Rejection of determinism. We align with a minority perspective within Marxism that rejects determinism. No single aspect of society is the ultimate determinant of others. Politics, culture, and economics are interdependent and shape each other. Overdetermination concept. We embrace Marx's notion of overdetermination, where all aspects of society condition and shape one another. This approach acknowledges the complexity and constant change in society, making comprehensive understanding challenging. Class analysis in Soviet context. Our class analysis, focused on surplus labor, does not assert that class determined the rise and fall of the USSR. Instead, it highlights overlooked aspects and relationships in other analyses. Surplus labor-based definition of socialism and communism. We define a communist class structure as one where the people who produce a surplus are the same people who collectively receive and distribute it. This concept helps differentiate socialism from communism and analyze the economic history of the USSR. Communism and non-class structures. Communist class structures can coexist with various political, cultural, and economic arrangements. This includes different forms of democracy, property ownership, and resource distribution. Communism as an interaction of class and non-class structures. Communism involves the interaction of communist class structures with non-class structures, leading to countless forms of communism based on these interactions. Methodological approach to social structures and changes. Our approach to understanding social structures and changes emphasizes the interaction between class and non-class structures, shaping our analysis of the USSR's history and the conclusion that communism never fully materialized there. Utopia and communism. A brief digression. The utopian essence of communism. Throughout history, communism has often been seen through a utopian lens as a vision of a perfect society where inequalities and injustices are eradicated. This utopian dream extends beyond mere distribution of wealth and power, aspiring to eliminate disparities in gender, race, ethnicity, and even cultural forms of inequality. It's a vision of a society where tolerance, nurturance, honesty, artistry, openness, and love are the norm in interpersonal relations. Bolsheviks and utopian aspirations. Many Bolsheviks, both within the USSR and globally, were motivated by these utopian ideals. They envisioned communism as a just, democratic, and free society where every individual achieves self-realization within a loving community. This utopian longing was not unique to them. It's a common thread in various political ideologies. Our perspective on utopian longings. While respecting these utopian aspirations, our approach diverges in two significant ways. Firstly, we emphasize the role of class, conceived as the social process of producing and distributing surplus labor, a concept often overlooked in utopian thought. Secondly, we adopt the principle of overdetermination, which suggests that no single aspect of society can automatically bring about a utopian communist state. The complexity of achieving utopia. From an overdetermination standpoint, utopians must struggle for every dimension of their desired society. Achieving collective ownership of wealth, for example, doesn't automatically lead to a democratic political system or a communist class structure. Every aspect of a utopian society must be fought for and won. No single achievement guarantees the rest. Broadening and challenging the utopian vision. Our approach both broadens the utopian vision by adding a class as surplus labor perspective and challenges it by recognizing that communist forms could include features far from utopian ideals. This raises critical questions about the nature of the struggle for a communist future and the choice between reforming capitalism and pursuing a less equal, less democratic communism. The moral and ethical dimensions. We argue that communist class structures devoid of exploitation are a worthy goal in themselves, based on moral, ethical, and aesthetic judgments. However, both class and non-class elements of a communist utopia must be actively pursued and sustained, as neither guarantees the other. Contradictions in utopian communism. Our Marxian theory acknowledges contradictions in all societies, including communism. We can envision a utopian communism without its own contradictions, both within and between its class and non-class dimensions. These contradictions will inevitably lead to changes and struggles. The dialectical nature of utopian visions. Utopian visions and societies are in a constant state of flux, influencing and being influenced by each other. Our current understanding of communism and utopia is a response to recent social changes, altering their meanings and impacts. The Soviet experiment and its lessons. The history of the USSR, with its strong utopian components, was a bold experiment in altering property ownership, production, cultural life, and power dynamics. While initial steps were taken towards some utopian aspects of communism, the failure to create communist class structures led to a lapse into state capitalist structures, ultimately undermining the utopian dimensions of the Bolshevik movement. This highlights the significant cost of overlooking the organization of surplus labor in shaping a society. A concrete communism today. Let's delve into the concept of communism, not just as a theoretical construct, but as a tangible, concrete system. We'll explore its various facets, focusing on the variant forms of communism, particularly the kind most familiar to us. Marx's analysis and our approach. Marx, in his analysis of capitalism in Capital, focused primarily on the form of capitalism prevalent in his era. Similarly, we'll start our exploration of communism by focusing on the form that aligns most closely with common perceptions. This includes state-managed distribution of resources and collectivized ownership of production means. Defining communism in terms of surplus. To understand this, we need to look at how communism organizes the production, appropriation, and distribution of its surplus. Here, let's define some key terms. Fundamental class process. This refers to producing and appropriating surplus labor. Subsumed class process. This involves distributing the appropriated surplus. Exploitation in different class structures. In feudal, slave, and capitalist structures, exploitation is evident as the performers of surplus labor are not the same individuals who appropriate and distribute the surplus. This is in contrast to the ancient class structure, where an individual handles all these aspects, albeit not collectively. Communist class process. In a communist system, the same individuals who perform surplus labor also collectively appropriate and distribute it. This collective appropriation and identity between producers and appropriators set communism apart from other class structures. Corporate capitalism versus communism. Interestingly, corporate capitalism involves a form of collective appropriation, but it's not the same collectivity as in communism. The board of directors in a corporation appropriates surplus labor, but they are not the same group that produces it, marking a clear distinction from communist structures. Communism without exploitation. In our view, specifying communist fundamental and subsumed class processes leads to a form of communism that is devoid of exploitation but still involves class conflicts. These conflicts revolve around the size of the surplus and its distribution. The labor process in communism. In a communist class structure, individuals collectively labor to produce basic goods and services. A portion of this labor is necessary for their own sustenance, while the surplus labor is collectively appropriated and used for the community's benefit. Distribution of surplus in communism. Once the surplus is collectively received by the workers, it is distributed to support various non-class processes necessary for the existence of the communist class structure. This includes political, cultural, and economic activities that encourage or compel communist laborers to continue their work. Communism beyond property and planning. While conventional notions of communism focus on collectivized property and planned distribution, our approach adds the dimension of a communist class structure. This leads to a specific type of communism characterized not just by collective ownership and planning, but also by a unique class structure. Political, economic, and cultural conditions. The final part of our discussion will explore the combinations of political, economic, and cultural conditions necessary to generate and sustain this form of communism, especially its class structure. Addressing criticisms of communism. We'll also address two common criticisms of communism: the belief that only small units can be organized communistically, and the notion that communism necessarily entails a highly centralized economy. In summary, our exploration of communism today focuses on understanding it as a system where surplus labor is collectively produced, appropriated, and distributed, setting it apart from other class structures and adding depth to the conventional understanding of communism. Centralization versus decentralization. Communist class structures comparison. In our exploration of communist class structures, we confront a pivotal question. Can these structures exist in large, technologically advanced, and secular societies like the United States, or are they only viable in small, technologically simple, kinship-dominated, or religiously motivated societies? Furthermore, is it necessary for communist class structures to entail highly centralized economies? Our analysis rejects the premises of these critical questions, grounded in the concept of overdetermination, which refuses to essentialize any one or a subset of non-class processes as prerequisites for a communist class structure. Communism, in our understanding, does not hinge on specific conditions such as a limited number of participants, religious fervor, spatial conditions, or degrees of centralization. What is crucial is how the totality of non-class processes combine to overdetermine a particular class structure. This perspective opens the possibility of communism as a feasible alternative for class structures in societies like the United States, not limited to small units nor necessarily entailing centralization. We observe that while communism is defined by an identity between the collectivities of surplus labor producers and appropriators, their geographic locations may vary. This spatial difference contributes to the complex variation in communist class structures. These variations reflect a continuum from decentralized to partially centralized to completely centralized arrangements. In decentralized arrangements, surplus production and appropriation occur at the same local production site. In partially centralized arrangements, surplus labor appropriation is aggregated across subsets of producing units. In completely centralized arrangements, appropriation is aggregated across all producing units. Consider the example of a single communist industrial or farming enterprise, or a family household. Here, the fruit of the communist surplus labor performed is also appropriated by that unit's surplus labor performers, who collectively receive it. This decentralized appropriation might involve members of the producing unit meeting at intervals to collectively distribute the surplus. In other scenarios, where physical assembly of surplus and appropriators is impractical, specific procedures ensure the social positioning of the producers of the surplus as its collective receivers and distributors. The cultural, political, and economic processes must be in place to ensure that the workers occupy these communist class positions. This is akin to capitalist corporate boards of directors delegating functions while retaining their role as appropriators and distributors of surplus labor. In decentralized communist class structures, managers may wield power over production and surplus, but they are not surplus appropriators. Power and appropriation are distinct, and other social processes ensure the communist producers' appropriators retain their collective appropriator status. In the United States, an example of decentralized communist appropriation can be found in certain family households, where household members collectively perform and appropriate surplus labor. These family appropriators then collectively distribute the proceeds to sustain household communism. This decentralized model can coexist with varying social conditions, such as simple household technology, religious beliefs, or family size. On the other hand, more centralized forms of communism involve local production of surplus labor with appropriation occurring on a more aggregated basis. Here, surpluses produced in different enterprises are appropriated by a collective comprising workers from these enterprises. This could extend to increasingly aggregated communist appropriators across many enterprises and households. Subordinate managers might be needed to organize the class structure, ensuring its communist form prevails. A society might contain multiple forms of communist fundamental class processes, such as centralized appropriation across enterprises and decentralized appropriation within households. Cultural and political processes may generate tensions and conflicts as members of a communist society navigate preferences for centralized versus decentralized appropriation. This discussion highlights two key qualities of communism: its immense range of variation and coexistence among its forms, and its own particular tensions, contradictions, and changes. These include the mix of decentralized and centralized appropriation, the delegation of subordinate management tasks, and the emergence and displacement of communist class structures by non-communist class structures. A comprehensive study of communist class structures would also need to consider situations where they coexist with non-communist class structures, exploring interactions and contradictions among multiple class structures. Cultural politics and economics of communism. The exploration of the cultural, political, and economic context necessary for communist class structures to exist in a modern industrial society presents a complex and multifaceted picture. In such a society, we might see centralized communist surplus labor appropriation across industrial enterprises, while decentralized appropriation occurs within households. This dual structure prompts us to consider the specific non-class processes that would support such a form of communism. The motivation for individuals to participate in a communist fundamental class process is not as straightforward as it might seem. While it could be assumed that individuals naturally desire to appropriate all that they produce, the existence of non-communist forms of surplus labor appropriation, such as capitalism, feudalism, and slavery, complicates this notion. These forms involve producing surplus labor for others, a concept Marx identified as exploitation. The preference for such systems over communism could be influenced by cultural perceptions, political ideologies, and economic theories. For instance, if communism is perceived as evil, hostile to religious traditions, or a threat to freedom, there would be little desire to participate in it. People might prefer capitalism, feudalism, or slavery, even acknowledging potential exploitation, due to their beliefs about these systems. Capitalism, in particular, might be seen as fair and just if it is conceptualized as a system where each part contributes to production and receives rewards proportionately. In contrast, communism might be depicted as opposed to human nature, unfair, oppressive, and economically inefficient. In the United States, for example, the advocacy of communism in households and enterprises is often equated with advocating for a destructive force against American society. Communist households are seen as eroding patriarchal family structures, and communist enterprises as stifling individual abilities to produce and reap wealth. This perception positions communism as an unrealizable utopian fantasy, inferior to the economic, political, and cultural arrangement of capitalism. Even if communism is understood as non-exploitative, individuals might still prefer exploitative systems if they view communal appropriation as impractical. A culture might develop that deems both capitalism undesirable and communism unrealizable, leading to a preference for individual self-employment, where the producer and appropriator of surplus labor are the same person. For communism to exist and thrive, it would require a cultural shift that interprets it as the good society and critiques alternative class structures for their injustice and lack of freedom. This communist culture would involve producing and disseminating meanings that support communist class processes, convincing individuals that surplus labor appropriation is a real and relevant part of human existence. It would also involve developing a class consciousness that recognizes and values communal appropriation as a way to eliminate social theft and exploitation, thereby fostering a new era of human behavior. In summary, the survival and flourishing of communist class processes in a modern industrial society would necessitate a comprehensive transformation in cultural, political, and economic spheres. This transformation would involve redefining values and perceptions around labor, appropriation, and societal organization, fostering a collective understanding and acceptance of communism as a viable and desirable alternative to existing class structures. In today's lecture, we delve into the intricate relationship between communist class structures and the cultural milieu necessary for their existence and sustainability. To illustrate, let's consider the United States as a case study. For a communist class structure to take root here, a significant cultural shift is required. This shift would involve redefining the traditional household dynamics, particularly the relationships between men and women, in terms of class exploitation. This new class-conscious culture would highlight the injustice inherent in women's provision of surplus labor to their husbands, recognizing it as a form of exploitation that adversely affects both genders in various aspects of life. Moreover, this shift in class consciousness would necessitate a re-evaluation of how enterprises are perceived. In the current capitalist framework, a small group of capitalists accrue immense wealth from the surplus labor of workers. The inherent injustice of this system, along with its broader social consequences such as wealth inequality and the corruption of democratic processes, would be emphasized in this new cultural context. Furthermore, the self-employed class, often romanticized for its independence, would be critiqued for the physical exhaustion and isolation it often entails. The cultural processes fostering this class consciousness would naturally incline individuals towards a communal appropriation of surplus labor. Communist class structures, under this new cultural paradigm, would be seen as essential to the realization of a genuine community and democracy. They would be associated with substantial improvements in the quality of life, both within households and in the broader society. This cultural shift would also motivate individuals to actively resist the persistence or resurgence of non-communist class processes. In this envisioned society, individuals engaged in producing and disseminating these new cultural meanings, through education, media, art, and so forth, would play a crucial role. They would occupy communist subsumed class positions, receiving a share of communist surplus labor as compensation for their efforts. Their role is vital. Without these cultural workers, the generation of communist surplus labor in households and enterprises might falter, endangering the survival of communist class structures. However, it's important to note that culture, inherently complex and multifaceted, is just one piece of the puzzle. A society's class structure is not solely determined by its cultural context. Political and economic conditions also play a crucial role in sustaining a class structure. In a communist class structure, for instance, the legal and political framework would need to radically differ from that of exploitative class structures. Laws would need to empower the collective of individuals who produce surplus with the exclusive right to appropriate it. In summary, for communist class structures to exist and thrive, a multifaceted approach is necessary. This approach must encompass cultural, political, and economic transformations. The cultural aspect involves fostering a class consciousness that recognizes and challenges existing exploitative structures. Politically, laws and regulations must be restructured to support communal appropriation of surplus labor. Economically, the system must facilitate the distribution and valuation of wealth produced by these communist structures. It's a complex interplay of various factors, each contributing to the sustenance and evolution of the desired class structure. Capitalist societies, like any other, are characterized by a blend of freedoms and unfreedoms, each interwoven in unique ways. In these societies, certain political conditions exist that define and maintain the class processes. For instance, the inability to privately own production means or engage in the buying and selling of commodities, including labor power, are political conditions crucial for the existence of communist class processes. Conversely, in capitalist societies, the unfreedoms, such as workers' inability to appropriate their surplus labor or to collectivize productive property, ensure the freedom of capitalists to appropriate other surplus labor. This dichotomy of freedom and unfreedom is often overlooked in non-Marxian approaches, which tend to conceptualize freedom without considering class implications. They view certain freedoms as essential for maximizing a society's wealth and happiness, often concluding that only capitalist societies can foster the necessary institutions for this. However, Marx and Engels argued that the freedoms associated with capitalism also bring about significant unfreedoms, like exploitation and vulnerability to business cycles, which negatively impact social wealth and happiness. Each society, therefore, develops its own standards and measures for assessing wealth, productivity, freedom, and happiness, both within itself and in comparison to other societies. For a capitalist class structure to persist, it must generally be viewed as preferable to any feasible alternatives. Similarly, for a communist class structure to endure, a different set of standards and measures must become dominant. Political processes play a crucial role in establishing and maintaining these class structures. For instance, in a communist society, laws and rules concerning collective ownership and non-market distribution of resources are vital. These political processes must also establish decision-making procedures on various aspects, such as who occupies specific class positions, the division of necessary and surplus labor, and the appropriation and distribution of surplus. Effective functioning of these political processes requires more than just the establishment and enforcement of laws. A combination of cultural, economic, and other political processes is necessary. For example, part of the culture in a communist society would foster a class consciousness that normalizes and values the participation in surplus appropriation and distribution as a crucial aspect of life. In this context, information dissemination becomes essential. Workers would regularly receive information about the surplus produced, historical data on previous appropriations and distributions, and forecasts of future surpluses and their potential impacts. This process of decision-making by workers in a communist structure contrasts with that in non-communist societies, like the decision-making by capitalist corporate boards. However, in an overdetermined world, where everything is in constant flux and interconnected, complete and absolute efficiency or understanding is unattainable. Any measurement of efficiency or economic impact is inherently subjective, reflecting the measurer's criteria for selecting causes and consequences. Therefore, the surplus labor information provided to communist producers will always be partial and influenced by the specific economic, political, and cultural conditions of the moment. This production and dissemination of information, embodying their own overdetermination, will then contribute to the decisions of workers, shaping the specific distribution of surplus labor. In considering the dynamics of power distribution within households under a communist class structure, we must recognize that only those who produce surplus within each household should participate in its collective appropriation and distribution. This approach necessitates a significant shift from traditional patriarchal power dynamics and gendered cultural processes, which often perpetuate women's labor for the benefit of men in many household structures. To sustain a communist class structure, a transformation in the political and cultural environment is essential, fostering a willingness among both men and women to engage in collective labor for mutual benefit within the household. This shift in household dynamics is part of a broader array of cultural and political conditions necessary for the existence of communist class structures. Individuals who contribute to creating these conditions perform vital non-class processes. Their efforts, funded by portions of communist surplus labor, place them in what we term communist subsumed class positions. These individuals include educators, artists, clerics, publicists, lawmakers, enforcers, and adjudicators, among others. The full-time engagement of these individuals in non-class processes may lead to the formation of a bureaucracy. This bureaucracy, while integral to the communist class-structured society, must be carefully considered. Its role and power are not static but subject to change based on various social conditions. For instance, internal conflicts within the bureaucracy or disagreements over surplus distribution could either destabilize the communist class structure or lead to a reconfiguration of relationships between the fundamental and subsumed classes. It's important to note that the presence and influence of a bureaucracy are not unique to communist structures. Bureaucratic power is a phenomenon observed across various class structures, including capitalist and feudal societies. In capitalism, for example, the state bureaucracy often plays a complex role, sometimes supporting private capitalists and at other times intervening more assertively in the economy. The dynamics of power within and between bureaucracies and fundamental classes, as well as within these classes themselves, vary across different class structures. These power struggles are shaped by the specific class and non-class processes of each society's context. Another critical aspect in a communist class structure is the decision-making process regarding the occupation of different class positions. This process might involve public education to prepare individuals for specific class roles. However, there is a Marxist tradition that views the fixity of class positions skeptically, suggesting that rotation through different class positions might be more conducive to maintaining a communist class structure. Such rotation allows individuals to understand and engage with the challenges of communism more comprehensively. Finally, we must consider the economic processes beyond the class processes of surplus production and appropriation. These include the mechanisms for producing and distributing goods and services, allocating productive resources, and managing credit and monetary relations. For a communist class structure to be sustained, these non-class economic processes must function in ways that support the ongoing production and appropriation of surplus, thereby maintaining the overall structure. Cultural Politics and Economics of Communism, Part 2. In this lecture, we delve into the intricacies of a communist fundamental class process, particularly focusing on its relationship with the division of labor in society. Let's consider a hypothetical communist society where labor specialization is evident. Some laborers produce food in rural farms, while others manufacture cloth in urban industries. This specialization necessitates a flow of use values between rural and urban areas, ensuring that food reaches cloth producers and vice versa. This flow is crucial for maintaining the communist class structure predicated on this division of labor. In our assumed model of communism, these exchanges between food and cloth producers do not occur through market mechanisms. This absence of market exchange is not to suggest that communist class structures inherently negate market mechanisms. Rather, we start without market mechanisms to address the traditional literature's rigid dissociation of communism from markets. Later, we will explore how communist class structures might coexist with market exchanges. In this communist setting, the distribution of labor, means of production, and produced goods and services is administered rather than determined by market forces. This administration involves planning, organizing, supervising, and executing distributions, a complex activity that transcends mere economic processes. It encompasses cultural and political processes as well. For instance, the production and allocation of goods and services among enterprises require plans and documents that justify how these activities serve communism. This administration is a critical component in sustaining the communist class structure. The planners and managers in this system might use Marxian value categories to assign values to food and cloth, based on the socially necessary abstract labor time required for each unit's production. These values are not just economic indicators, but are overdetermined, reflecting a myriad of factors including technical, natural, economic, political, and cultural conditions. In this context, values are socially constructed designations of worth, influenced by the prevailing system of meanings in society. Contrasting this with private capitalisms with free markets, where values or prices reflect the social conditions of private buyers and sellers, in our communist model, values reflect the state planning agency's interpretations and calculations. These include considerations of political trends, technical conditions of production, development strategies, regional, ethnic, and gender goals, and more. In both capitalist and communist systems, values are shaped by their respective social contexts. However, these contexts differ significantly. In our communist model, workers collectively appropriate the surplus, replacing capitalists. The collectivity of citizens owns the means of production, displacing private ownership. Planners, rather than private buyers and sellers, distribute wealth. Consequently, the values assigned to resources and products in each system are constituted differently and fulfill distinct social roles. This nuanced understanding of value in a communist system reveals the complex interplay of economic, political, and cultural processes in shaping the class structure. In our exploration of communist class structures, we encounter the concept of administered values, which are pivotal in understanding the dynamics of such a system. These values can fluctuate based on various factors. For instance, if communist appropriators decide to intensify the use of machinery in cloth and food production, this increases the indirect labor requirements, potentially raising administered values. Conversely, if there is an enhancement in worker productivity across enterprises, reducing the direct labor per output unit, administered values might decrease. Additionally, concrete political and cultural factors play a role. For example, in response to perceived external threats, communist workers might extend their work hours, increasing output and surplus for military or other purposes, which in turn affects values. In private capitalism, the impacts of similar changes on values would differ due to the distinct social context. Market competition in private capitalism shapes values differently compared to the communist context, where other forms of competition and absence of market forces play a role. It's crucial to recognize these different determinants in shaping values in diverse societal structures. In our communist model, the administered values for produced inputs and outputs differ from capitalist market values. This difference extends to surplus values and profit rates, necessitating specific adjectives like communist administered or capitalist market to denote their distinct contexts and roles. In the communist regime we assume, where free markets and private property are absent, these values align with the state's administrative mechanisms. The individuals in subsumed class state agency positions, apart from determining values, also decide on the amount of surplus labor, technical conditions of labor, and the portion of social product returned to workers for consumption. These decisions contribute to the reproduction of the communist fundamental class process. The difference between the total output's administered values and the values of used-up materials and workers' wages yields the administered surplus value. This surplus value, in relation to wages and used-up materials, gives us the administered rates of profit for each enterprise. In this system, communist subsumed classes might allocate resources based on these profit rates, or they might consider other variables like military needs, cultural goals, or minimizing ethnic conflicts. The respect given to profit in decision-making can vary. Assuming administered profit rates are a criterion, there could be competition among communist enterprises, analogous yet distinct from capitalist enterprise competition. This competition in communism might focus on different aspects, like fulfilling state-administered quotas, and would lack elements like price and advertising competition. Like in private capitalism, the effects of competitive strategies in communism are complex and ramify throughout the economy, impacting administered values and profits. Both capitalists and communists face the challenge of incomplete information regarding the full spectrum of costs and benefits of their actions. Within communist households, resource and use value flows might occur without an exchange process, organized in terms of physical quantities. Household members managing these flows might receive a share of the surplus for sustaining household communism. These managers could, theoretically, attach values to household outputs using socially necessary abstract labor times, similar to enterprise products. However, this is less likely in practice, though it remains a logical parallel. In examining communist fundamental class processes, we must consider how they are influenced by labor productivity, defined as the ratio of labor time inputs to physical units of output. An increase in productivity, whether in enterprises or households, can augment the quantity of goods and services available for distribution, potentially bolstering the reproduction of communism. However, it's crucial to distinguish changes in productivity from changes in class processes. A growth in productivity doesn't necessarily modify the ratio of necessary to surplus labor time. In fact, the complex interplay of social processes might lead to unexpected outcomes. For instance, increased productivity and the resultant wealth could, under certain conditions, pose a threat to the communist class process. Workers in more productive enterprises might demand higher wages, potentially sparking demands for a shift from communist to non-communist class structures. Non-class economic processes in a communist society can become focal points of struggle, distinct from class struggles. These non-class struggles might revolve around issues like the terms of resource flows between rural and urban areas, the choice between market and administered valuation mechanisms, or the distribution of gains from increased productivity. It's important to differentiate these from class struggles, which concern the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus labor. Non-class struggles over economic, political, and cultural conditions don't have an inherent connection to the society's class structure or class struggles. The impact of these struggles on communist class structures is not predetermined. They could either strengthen or weaken these structures and may influence class struggles in various ways. The evolution of these contradictions and struggles is shaped by the broader social context. In our analysis of a specific form of communism, we've initially focused on enterprises and households as the primary sites of communist class processes. However, we can extend this to include a communist subsumed class located elsewhere, such as the state, in a society with predominantly communist class structures. State officials, in performing various cultural, political, and economic non-class processes, contribute to the conditions necessary for the existence of communist class structures. The state, funded by distributions from communist surpluses, becomes another integral component of the society, interacting with communist enterprises and households. This perspective of the state's role diverges from traditional Marxian views, which often saw the state's existence as indicative of incomplete communism. Lenin, for example, viewed the state as a temporary necessity in the transition to communism, with its eventual dissolution signaling the achievement of a fully communist society. This analysis, however, suggests a more nuanced understanding of the state's role, recognizing its mutual dependence with communist class structures for the survival of this particular form of communism. In our analysis, the existence of a state within various forms of communism is not only compatible with the absence of exploitation, but also crucial in maintaining that absence. Contrary to Lenin's view, where the state is seen as a temporary measure in the transition to communism, we argue that the dissolution of the state could actually endanger communist class structures and potentially lead to a resurgence of exploitation. This perspective marks a significant departure from traditional Marxist theories of the state and its relation to class. Lenin and other Marxists often adopted an essentialist view of the state, attributing its existence solely to economic determinants, specifically exploitation, and viewing its primary function as preserving exploitative class structures. This aligns with the classical Marxist metaphor where the economic base of society ultimately determines the superstructure, including the state. In this framework, the state is seen as a one-way causation from class to state, implying that the absence of class divisions, as in communism, would negate the need for a state or necessitate only a temporary transitional state. However, this view extends the state's lifespan in the transition from the lower to the higher phase of communism, as inequities persist, and wealth distribution based on labor, a bourgeois right, continues to dominate rather than distribution based on need. The state, in this context, is seen as necessary to maintain social peace and guide society towards full communism, where need-based distribution would render the state obsolete. This concept of the state as a dictatorship of the proletariat is also seen as a safeguard against the re-establishment of exploitation by capitalists or others committed to exploitative class structures. Our approach, however, rejects this essentialist view of the state. We treat the communist state as an overdetermined social construct, influenced by and influencing other similarly overdetermined sites. This means that the state's existence, duration, and functions are not mere reflections of the class structure, but are shaped by a multitude of factors, class and non-class processes. Communisms can exist with or without various forms of state apparatus, and the relationship between state and class in communism is shaped by the specific historical context of that relationship. While we diverge from Lenin's economic determinism, we concur with his broader perspective that the existence of state institutions under communism is not the primary concern, but rather how these institutions exist and operate in new ways. Lenin outlines several characteristics that a communist state should possess, such as electiveness and instant recall of officials, payment no higher than that of ordinary workers, and a system where everyone periodically takes on bureaucratic roles, preventing the formation of a permanent bureaucratic class. These measures aim to mitigate potential tensions and conflicts arising from income distribution disparities, and to support a cultural and political environment emphasizing equality and collectivity. Such legislative and procedural frameworks would form part of the political infrastructure that overdetermines the existence of the communist class process, illustrating the complex and multifaceted nature of the state's role in a communist society. In our theoretical construct of concrete communism, the state plays a multifaceted role, deeply intertwined with the communist class structures. The laws and procedures, along with the cultural milieu that shapes their interpretation and application, are designed to mitigate power imbalances and income disparities within the communist society. These measures aim to prevent the emergence of a new class society, where concentrated power in the hands of a few state officials could transform them from communist subsumed class officials into non-communist collective appropriators of surplus. This potential transformation signifies the end of communism in that society, underscoring the necessity of mechanisms like rotation of subsumed class positions, sophisticated voting procedures, and equitable rewards for all workers. However, despite these efforts, individual differences and the ceaseless overdetermination of social processes mean that the potential for transitions from communist to non-communist societies, and vice versa, is always present. In the specific model of communism discussed in this chapter, the state is integral to the communist class structures, providing essential conditions for their existence and receiving portions of the communist surpluses. The state's dissolution without alternative support mechanisms could endanger the communist class structure. However, the possibility of the state withering away is contingent and not inherent in a communist society. The state is a nexus of various processes, subject to diverse demands and conflicts, which can lead to a multitude of outcomes. For instance, consider a communist state with distinct sub-agencies like a communist party, an economic ministry, and other entities such as military and educational institutions. Each of these sub-agencies plays a role in maintaining and supporting the communist class structures, funded by distributions from the communist surplus. If these agencies, driven by their respective mandates, demand increased shares of the surplus, it could lead to subsumed class struggles as they contest the available surplus. Alternatively, the state could pressure communist producers in enterprises to generate additional surplus to meet these demands. This could lead to an increase in the rate of communist surplus appropriation, or it might spark resistance from the workers, potentially escalating into a broader struggle over the nature of the class structure itself. In our envisioned concrete communism, the paths of historical development are infinite, shaped by the endless variations in non-class processes, cultural, political, economic, that provide conditions for the existence of communist class processes. These paths are also influenced by the contradictions within and between the communist fundamental and subsumed class processes, as well as the interactions between the communist class structure and the myriad non-class processes and non-communist class processes in its social context. The overdetermination of each social process by all others renders each process inherently contradictory, embodying the diverse influences and tensions from the broader social framework. This complexity and interconnectivity of processes generate the dynamic changes, conflicts, and struggles that characterize the history and evolution of such a communist society. Our theoretical framework aims to illuminate this range of possibilities and the underlying mechanisms driving them. How societies differ, a methodological problem. In our exploration of societal forms, a fundamental question arises. How do we differentiate one society from another? This challenge is not unique to the study of the USSR or to Marxism, but extends across all social theories. Societies are complex, with infinite processes, and our understanding of them changes depending on which aspects we choose to focus on. This leads to diverse theories and debates about societal identity. For instance, the historical debate on Europe's transition from feudalism to capitalism hinges on what processes are considered crucial. Sweezy saw the rise of commodity production and merchant capital as indicators of the shift to capitalism, while Dobb and Hilton viewed these as signs of a new form of feudalism. This debate is more than academic. It's about how we define and understand the boundaries of societal systems like feudalism and capitalism. Our approach in this lecture uses the concept of class, defined in terms of surplus labor, as a key to understanding a society's nature and boundaries. This Marxist perspective is not static. It evolves as we link class to the myriad non-class aspects of society. This ongoing process means our understanding of class, and thus of societal systems, is always in flux. Consider the various forms of communism. By incorporating different non-class processes, such as how resources are owned and distributed, we arrive at different interpretations of communism. This approach is not about finding fixed definitions, but about understanding that our theories are temporary interventions in a constantly changing social landscape. The challenge of identifying a society, like labeling it communist or capitalist, is complicated by the dynamic nature of societies. Any label we apply is a temporary snapshot, an illusion of stability in a process of continual change. This is particularly true in Marxist theory, where the concept of overdetermination suggests that a society is always evolving, shaped by a multitude of interconnected factors. In summary, our understanding of societal forms, whether it's communism, capitalism, or any other system, is shaped by the processes we choose to emphasize in our analysis. These choices are influenced by our theoretical perspectives and are always subject to change as new connections and insights emerge. This dynamic approach reflects the complex, ever-changing nature of societies themselves. Summary: Introduction to Societal Forms. The chapter begins by addressing a fundamental question in social theory. How do we differentiate between societal forms? This includes distinguishing various forms of communism from each other and from non-communist systems. The USSR as a case study. The USSR's history is used as a key example. The chapter explores whether the USSR can be classified as socialist or communist, considering its state planning and collective ownership, which some argue are indicative of its socialist or communist nature. Theoretical challenges. The chapter acknowledges the complexity in identifying societal forms due to the infinite processes that constitute a society. Theories vary based on which processes they deem definitive of a society's identity. Historical debates. It references historical debates, such as those on the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe, to illustrate differing viewpoints on societal change and classification. Role of class in societal identification. The chapter emphasizes using class, specifically in terms of surplus labor, as a standard for theorizing the nature and boundaries of societies. It discusses how class is influenced by and interacts with non-class aspects of society. Marxian analysis. The approach is rooted in Marxian analysis, which is seen as an ongoing process. The understanding of class and class analysis evolves as new linkages are drawn between class and non-class aspects of society. The fluidity of societal labels. It argues that societal labels like communist or capitalist are transient and subject to change, reflecting the continuous evolution of societal structures and processes. Overdetermination methodology. The chapter introduces the concept of overdetermination, suggesting that a society is continually presented as different at any given moment, complicating the process of labeling it. Communism and non-class processes. It delves into how different forms of communism can arise based on how non-class processes, like resource ownership and distribution, are integrated. Theoretical and practical implications. The chapter discusses the implications of these theories for understanding social structures and changes, emphasizing the relative nature of definitions and boundaries in social analysis. Communism in historical context. It touches upon historical examples of communist societies and the importance of understanding the specific class structures within them. Complexity of class structures. The chapter concludes by highlighting the complexity of class structures within societies, noting that multiple class structures can coexist and interact in various ways. Javier Milei's ideology, as gleaned from his interview with The Economist and other public statements, can be summarized as follows. 1. Philosophical foundation. Milei's transition from a recalcitrant neoclassicist to an anarcho-capitalist reflects his deep-rooted belief in minimal government intervention. Influenced by Murray Rothbard, he advocates for a society where voluntary contracts replace government in providing services, including education, environmental protection, and law enforcement. 2. Critique of the state. He views the state as inherently coercive, particularly in its collection of taxes, which he likens to actions at gunpoint. Milei argues for the dismantling of the welfare state, emphasizing individual responsibility and condemning the transfer of decision-making costs to others. 3. Pragmatic approach to governance. Despite his anarcho-capitalist leanings, Milei adopts a more pragmatic monarchist approach in practice. He envisions a limited state primarily focused on maintaining the army, police, and judiciary to enforce property rights. 4. Economic policy and reforms. Milei proposes radical economic reforms aimed at drastically reducing the size and role of the government. These include cutting public spending significantly, aiming for a zero primary deficit, eliminating subsidies, reducing the number of government ministries, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and overhauling the tax system. 5. Education and healthcare. He suggests introducing market competition into traditionally state-run sectors like education and healthcare. This includes a voucher system for education and moving towards an insurance-based model for healthcare, although he acknowledges the limited federal control over these areas. 6. Dollarization and economic strategy. A key proposal is the dollarization of Argentina's economy, which he believes will stabilize the financial system. This ambitious plan faces considerable challenges, including the need for substantial foreign investment and market confidence. 7. Legislative process and use of referendums. Milei expresses a preference for passing reforms through Congress, but does not dismiss the use of referendums, especially for major changes like eliminating the central bank and downsizing other state sectors. 8. Foreign policy and international relations. His foreign policy stance is primarily anti-socialist. He shows admiration for figures like Jair Bolsonaro and skepticism towards climate change and pro-choice movements. His suggestion to withdraw from Mercosur indicates a willingness to reshape Argentina's international trade relationships. 9. Personal style and controversies. Milei is known for his confrontational and often polarizing rhetoric. He holds controversial views on historical and current political issues and is unafraid to express these candidly, which has both attracted a following and drawn criticism. 10. Challenges and criticism. Critics question the feasibility and potential impact of Milei's proposals, particularly regarding the economy. His approach to international politics and trade is seen as overly simplistic and potentially damaging to Argentina's interests. In essence, Javier Milei's ideology is a blend of libertarian and anarcho-capitalist principles, advocating for drastic reductions in government size and scope, economic liberalization, and a confrontational, often polarizing personal and political style. His views represent a significant departure from traditional political norms in Argentina, aiming to reshape the country's economic and political landscape fundamentally. All shock, no therapy. The phrase all shock, no therapy is often used as a critique of economic policies known as shock therapy. To understand this critique, it's important to first grasp what shock therapy is in the context of economic reform. Shock therapy in economics. Shock therapy refers to the rapid implementation of market-oriented reforms introduced to transition a country from a centrally planned economy to a market-based one. This approach was notably applied in several post-communist countries in the early 1990s, including Russia and Poland. Key elements of shock therapy typically include liberalizing prices, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and reducing government spending to curb inflation. Critique: all shock, no therapy. The critique encapsulated in the phrase all shock, no therapy suggests that while these reforms create immediate and often painful economic and social disruptions, the shock, they fail to provide the anticipated benefits or therapy for the economy in the long run. This critique can be broken down into several key points. 1. Immediate hardship. The rapid implementation of reforms often leads to immediate hardship for the population. This includes skyrocketing prices, increased unemployment, and a collapse of social safety nets. The shock is felt intensely by the general populace, particularly those who are vulnerable and less able to adapt to rapid changes. 2. Long-term economic struggles. Instead of leading to a quick and robust economic recovery, these policies can result in prolonged economic hardship. Critics argue that the expected therapy, in the form of economic growth, stability, and improved living standards, either takes much longer to materialize than promised or doesn't occur at all. 3. Increased inequality. The rapid privatization of state assets and the creation of market economies can lead to significant increases in inequality. A small segment of the population often benefits disproportionately from these changes, acquiring wealth and power, while the majority may see little improvement in their living conditions. 4. Inadequate institutional framework. Successful market economies require strong institutions, such as regulatory bodies, legal systems, and financial institutions. Critics of shock therapy argue that the rapid pace of reform does not allow for the gradual development of these necessary institutions, leading to issues like corruption, poor governance, and financial crises. 5. Political and social unrest. The economic hardship and increased inequality can lead to political and social unrest. In some cases, this has resulted in a backlash against the reforms, political instability, and a longing for the return of the old economic system. In summary, the all shock, no therapy critique of shock therapy argues that while these policies introduce rapid and often painful changes, they fail to deliver the promised economic recovery and improvement in living standards, at least in the short to medium term. Instead, they can lead to increased inequality, prolonged economic hardship, and social and political instability. Javier Milei, the newly elected president of Argentina, has pledged to implement a shock therapy economic strategy to balance the country's budget in the coming year, aiming to curb hyperinflation. This strategy, revealed following his electoral victory, involves drastic public spending cuts, as Milei asserts that there is simply no money left. He warns that failing to make these fiscal adjustments could lead Argentina towards hyperinflation, similar to what was experienced in the early 1990s. Key aspects of Milei's shock therapy. 1. Public spending cuts. Milei's primary focus is on significantly reducing public expenditure. He argues that not doing so would further escalate consumer prices, which are already soaring at an annual rate of over 140%. 2. Economic restructuring. His economic model includes cutting down governmental institutions, eliminating the central bank, and moving towards dollarization. 3. Impact on debt and interest payments. Milei mentioned that his yet-to-be-revealed economic team would handle the central bank's short-term debt balance. He highlighted that the central bank's interest payments on peso bonds amount to about 10% of Argentina's GDP. 4. Targeting political spending. Milei insists that these spending cuts would primarily affect the political class and their allies, not ordinary citizens. He suggests that public works projects should seek private capital. 5. Market response. Following his election, the markets in Argentina reportedly reacted positively to Milei's victory. 6. Transition and critique of previous administration. During the government transition, Milei met with outgoing President Alberto Fernandez and criticized the latter's administration for excessive spending that led to hyperinflation. 7. Economic challenges. Milei inherits an economy on the brink of recession. Argentina's economy showed stagnation in September, with a 0.7% year-over-year decrease in GDP. The country is facing its sixth recession in a decade, with an annual consumer price increase exceeding 143%. 8. Proposed dollarization and central bank closure. Milei has promised to replace the Argentine peso with the US dollar and to shut down Argentina's central bank. 9. Economic forecast. The Argentine economy shrank by 2.8% in the second quarter, the steepest decline since the peak of the pandemic in early 2020. A severe drought impacting agricultural exports and accelerating food inflation has heavily strained the economy. Economists predict a 2% contraction in the economy this year and further contraction in 2024. Milei's approach reflects his commitment to radical economic reforms to address Argentina's long-standing issues with inflation and economic instability. His strategy, rooted in libertarian principles, aims to drastically reshape Argentina's economic landscape, though it remains to be seen how these changes will impact the broader population and the country's economic health in the long term. In summary, Milei believes in a more radical or Puritan version of the Chicago or Austrian School of Economics. It's one giant leap forward from classic neoliberal economics we had for half a century. World Systems Analysis Perspective. 1. Core versus periphery dynamics. Wallerstein's model divides the world into core, semi-periphery, and periphery nations, with core countries dominating the global economic system. Argentina, traditionally seen as a semi-periphery or periphery nation, faces challenges in asserting its economic autonomy and development. Milei's radical economic policies, inspired by the Chicago and Austrian schools, could be seen as an attempt to shift Argentina's position within this global system. By reducing reliance on external financial systems, like the IMF, and adopting dollarization, Milei might be aiming to move Argentina closer to the core, or at least to reduce its peripheral vulnerabilities, which we all know what will happen if you show your weakness to the hyenas. 2. Global capitalism and national autonomy. Wallerstein emphasizes the tension between the global capitalist system and national autonomy. Milei's approach, with its emphasis on drastic economic restructuring and reduced state intervention, could be interpreted as an attempt to navigate this tension. By reducing the size and role of the state, Milei might believe he is enhancing Argentina's autonomy within the global capitalist system, or enhancing global capitalist system with Argentina labor and human resources market. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. David Harvey's critique of neoliberalism. 1. Neoliberalism and its discontents. Harvey critiques neoliberalism for its emphasis on free markets, deregulation, and privatization, arguing that these policies often lead to increased inequality and social injustice. Milei's ideology, which takes neoliberal principles to a more extreme level, could be subject to similar criticisms. The drastic reduction in public spending and the privatization of state functions might exacerbate existing inequalities in Argentina. Resnick would likely focus on how Milei's policies impact class structures within Argentina. The shift towards a more extreme form of neoliberal economics, with its emphasis on privatization and reduced state intervention, could lead to a reconfiguration of class relations, potentially exacerbating the exploitation of the working class. Resnick would be interested in how these policies affect the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus labor, and might argue that they could lead to greater exploitation of workers. 2. The role of the state. Harvey argues that under neoliberalism, the state's role shifts from providing welfare to ensuring favorable conditions for capital accumulation. Milei's policies, particularly his focus on reducing public spending and dismantling welfare structures, align with this shift. However, his approach might further reduce the state's capacity to mitigate inequalities and provide social safety nets. There is when Wagner Group and French Foreign Legion alikes can take part. Famous quote, "A rule of power is that if there is a power vacuum, it will get filled." Quote, "A rule of power is that if there is a power vacuum, it will get filled. The U.S. needs to lead the way in bringing international order to the world." By Will Hurd, husband, author, Common Sense Republican ex-congressman, CIA, cyber and DI executive. 3. Economic and social consequences. Harvey's analysis suggests that such neoliberal policies can lead to short-term economic gains, but often at the cost of long-term social and economic stability. Milei's shock therapy approach, while potentially stabilizing the economy in the short term, might lead to increased social unrest, political instability, and long-term economic challenges. Dollarization means perfect cross-border capital liquidation, and all barriers for capital flights currently in place would be removed. 4. Urbanization and spatial dynamics. Harvey also focuses on the spatial dimensions of neoliberalism, including urbanization and the development of cities. Milei's policies, especially those related to privatization and reduced public spending, could significantly impact urban development in Argentina, potentially leading to increased urban inequality and spatial segregation. 5. Historical materialism. Finally, Resnick would approach Milei's ideology from a historical materialist perspective, considering how these economic policies are a product of and a response to historical and material conditions in Argentina and the global economy. He would analyze how Milei's policies are influenced by and in turn influence the historical development of Argentina's social and economic structures. Appendix by a Marxist. Analyzing Javier Milei's ideology through the lens of Marxist and communist theories, particularly considering your previous inputs on communism, offers a unique perspective. Milei's ideology, rooted in a radical form of neoliberal economics, stands in stark contrast to Marxist principles. Here's a detailed analysis. 1. Class struggle and labor exploitation. From a Marxist viewpoint, Milei's advocacy for extreme neoliberal policies, including significant reductions in public spending and privatization, could be seen as exacerbating the class struggle. Marxist theory posits that capitalism inherently exploits the working class, and Milei's policies might intensify this exploitation by diminishing the state's role in regulating the economy and protecting workers' rights. This could lead to a more pronounced divide between the bourgeoisie, capital owners, and the proletariat workers, a central concern in Marxist analysis. 2. State's role in capitalist society. Marxists view the state as an instrument of class domination. Milei's approach to minimize state intervention aligns with a neoliberal agenda, which Marxists would argue only serves to further the interests of the capitalist class. By reducing state involvement in the economy, Milei's policies could limit the state's capacity to redistribute wealth and provide social welfare, thereby reinforcing capitalist class structures. 3. Contradictions and crises of capitalism. Marxist theory emphasizes the contradictions and crises inherent in capitalism. Milei's policies, while aimed at economic stabilization and growth, might inadvertently heighten these contradictions. For instance, reducing public spending and privatizing state functions could lead to short-term economic gains, but might also result in long-term social and economic instability, increased inequality, and heightened class conflict. 4. Global capitalism and imperialism. Marxist analysis, particularly Lenin's theory of imperialism, would consider how Milei's economic policies position Argentina within the global capitalist system. The move towards policies like dollarization might be seen as increasing Argentina's dependency on imperialist nations, particularly the United States. This could be interpreted as a form of neo-colonialism, where Argentina's economic sovereignty is compromised in favor of integration into a global capitalist system dominated by imperialist powers. 5. Dialectical materialism. From a dialectical materialist perspective, Milei's ideology would be seen as a historical development influenced by the material conditions of contemporary global capitalism. His policies might be viewed as a reaction to the challenges faced by Argentina within the global capitalist framework, but also as a reinforcement of the capitalist mode of production, which Marxists argue is inherently flawed and exploitative. 6. Revolutionary potential. Finally, a Marxist analysis might explore the revolutionary potential arising from Milei's policies. By intensifying class struggle and economic contradictions, these policies could paradoxically create conditions ripe for revolutionary change, as predicted by Marx. The worsening of economic inequalities and the potential marginalization of the working class could lead to increased class consciousness and revolutionary fervor. In summary, from a Marxist and communist perspective, Javier Milei's radical neoliberal ideology would likely be viewed as a reinforcement of capitalist exploitation and class domination, exacerbating the inherent contradictions of capitalism and potentially leading to heightened class struggle and instability. This analysis would emphasize the need to understand Milei's policies in the context of global capitalist dynamics and their implications for class relations and economic sovereignty in Argentina.
Boom! Until our narratives intertwine once more, I remain Tim. Wishing you insightful journeys. Brace for tomorrow, for with it comes another chapter in the annals of Treesliff Peace and the Reactionaries. Farewell until we reconvene.